My name is Maureen Therese McGroddy. I'm a religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, and before coming to Berkeley for my own sabbatical, I was ministering in our international school in Rome, Italy. And I have shared 24 years of ministry, and just thinking about it and just trying in my mind brings me such joy, and reliving my years at SAT. It was absolutely the most transforming. It was like an earthquake. But luckily, nothing fell permanently. My own sabbatical was started when I said I came from Rome, and there are no words to describe my inner journey and what God did for me that time. I just don't have words. It also, unknowingly to me, was the best preparation for the ministry that God was obviously preparing me for, but I didn't know. When we first got there, we had a professor, and we got a lot of readings and whatnot. And I had understood the program, you could do it for credit or not on credit. And so I had asked that. So two other of the men who were thinking that, I didn't want to spend my time reading. I think I had to spend more time reflecting. We went up to Frank Newman. He always tells the story. And we knocked on the door pretty bravely, and we said, "We have something to ask you. And do we have to do this for credit?" And he hummed and hawed as he can. Well, we'd really like you to. And I said, well, I don't really think that I want to do that, because it's not what I'm looking for. And he's such a sweetheart. He looked at me, and we just pinned him down, do we have to? And of course, we immediately went down to our participants, our fellow participants, and said, you know, you can do this without writing papers and doing it for credit. Well, that was quite amazing to everybody, and it changed. I think if it had been for credit, I would have left. That's not what I was looking for. At that time also, I began ministry then when they came to me right after my own sabbatical. And I just couldn't get over it. Our president, Edward Gillen, SJ, he wanted to become immediately. And at that time, the offices were up on the 3rd floor where the residence is, if you can imagine, and all the offices. And the deal was based on a Jesuit model, and it's a funny name they have. It's the Jesuit that gets messages from the superior and brings them back to the people. And when I heard that, I thought, first of all, I couldn't do much about the offices on the 3rd floor, but when I did talk about what I would like to do at SAT, along with the admissions and housing and whatnot, was that I said I needed much more involvement with the participants. That, I think, was what gift I could bring. And I always felt, while I'm ministering to them, they were ministering to me. They energized me, inspired me, challenged me. Another big thing that year was we stressed the non-credit. And within 2 years, it was turning to people doing a credit as a great minority. Every year they would less and less. And I remember a board meeting where one of our, Francis Bauer, who was a Franciscan, was on our board, and he said, what is happening to your program that you're only having 12 people do it for credit, and out of the 40 or whatever? And Frank, who smiled and said, there she is, ask her. But I honestly think I was coming out of my own needs, but it was really the feeling of the time. People didn't need more information. They needed freedom and reflection and fun, And so writing papers may not have been wasn't the best for all of us. The other thing we did, I think, that made a big difference when I was at SAT, there was a full sabbatical and a 9-month one, and that was it. And so when in the fall we had this big number, but in the winter, spring, it was really kind of startling to have, maybe 36 people, or no, even less. And so I asked what we could do about implementing a fall, a 9-month, and winter, spring. And that has worked out, I think, beautifully. And it took some arranging, but it was people were able to come that wouldn't ordinarily be able to come. And later, another big thing, I think, was a monumental thing, again, was that we were able, after much begging, to get housing at St. Albert's Out. And I remember Frank, he said, "Therese, you've asked enough." I said, "Just give me one more chance, please." He said, "Okay, do what you want." And honest to God, the prior looked at me and he said, "I'm going to a house meeting or whatever, the council meeting this weekend." And I said, "Dennis, I'm not going to ask you again, but there are all these empty rooms. And I think we can help you and you can help us." And he came back beaming on Monday. He said everybody thought it was a great idea. So I don't know what changed their minds. And so we were able then to go to town. The prior was wonderful, but he gave me someone to work with, Xavier Colavecchia, who was an older man, not older, but had become a Dominican later in life. And so he and I sat down and said, "All right, he asked, what do you need for SAT?" So I listed what needs we would have, about a lounge for ourselves and, rooms, and the rooms needed to be carpeted. They needed a lot of work and a desk, and, because they were just a mess. They hadn't been used for years. And then the dining room, I thought it was really important we have a separate dining room so we wouldn't be mixed in, because I think what their community is doing and what our community is doing is very different. I think just in those beginning years, when I came to SAT, they didn't call it the core team, but there were wonderful people that were faculty, and we would consult and whatnot. So that particular group emerged every year, and we got clear of what it was. But in the beginning, I especially remember Mary Cross from the GTU and Pam Sullivan and Frank Hodak, SJ, as being on that team of working with us, advising us, and whatnot. In later years, Greg Camella of the Congregation of the Precious Blood, and especially Kathleen Gannon, developed and continually helped us to come to the emphasis of what we were about, which was spirituality and renewal and conversion. Other highlights that come to mind, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but that popped into my mind last night actually, but I've been thinking about it, of course, is the ministry that Frank and Edward, Father Edward, and Bernie and Jim, for a short time, as well as our core team from the time I began. I really know what collaborative ministry means. It's not a word, I experienced it over and over. And Bernie used to always say to me, even for the two of us trying to make decisions, that I would come from things one way and he'd come from another. But we'd end up with a third, with a mix that was far better than anything I could think of, And I think having experienced that was, I don't think people experience that. I shouldn't say that. I think it's hard to experience that today. And we lived it. And I really, it made such a difference in my life. We also had wonderful support people. Maureen O'Brien, who was my first secretary, and Mary Lois Carey, Bonnie Bryant, 18 Halsey, of course, and Ron Figazi, who came out of nowhere to be our computer person volunteering. One question I was asked about, what about my own sabbatical? I think I've told you about the practicalities, but I think I came from Rome just knowing I needed to do something. And I didn't know what it was, but it was this call from within. I'd been there 15 years. As I said, I didn't want to become a Roman ruin. I could feel in that situation in Rome at that time, it was quite hard when I didn't work with the Vatican or anything, but even in certain situations and things we went to, liturgy, all of that. We had our own, but when we got out of our own conclave, it was like, where am I? The other thing I think that came to me is, I've been out of my own country for 15 years, and I needed to reconnect, because if I didn't, I would stay in Rome forever. And I didn't know where the growth would ever come. I mean, I don't say I wouldn't have grown, but I wouldn't have grown in ways that I could never have imagined. I'd be nourished, because we only grow with nourishment. And so I would say my own sabbatical, even though we talked about no credit, because we got that clear right in the beginning, is that it enabled me to go into a very deep place. And I fell apart, quite honestly. Frank Hodak, who I'm indebted to for life, was my spiritual director. And so I came through a whole period of questioning my faith, questioning religious life, the church, and when I got to SAT, I heard a lot of people in my group, not the same, but going through the same questioning, is it worth it? And church just doesn't seem to be progressing very well, the whole question of women and social justice. And this was the place where I could be a mess and accepted, guided, and I know Frank once saying, don't worry. I said, I'm losing my faith. This is Frank Hodak. He said, well, I think it would be a good idea if you did. You'd be better off than with faith. You have! I was like so shocked. And that was a great, it just had to, I just had to fall apart and come back together again in a different way. So I just can't tell you. It was very hard and difficult, but there was such grace in it and hope. Because when he said that, he said, you've been serving a false god for so long. My whole image of God, I've got to measure up, I've got to do this, and instead of living in God's unconditional love.